Our guest today is Professor Marta Podemska-Mikluch, and she is a professor of economics at Beloit College. She was here at Rockford College visiting to give a talk on economic history, focusing on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 16th century. Now, this is a historical example, but one that has contemporary relevance for how we do democracy in modern times. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a very early modern experiment in that. What was democratic about it? I know we have this thin conception of democracy and thicker conception of democracy. What's the difference between that?
Well, nowadays we tend to associate democracy with voting. Yes, we think that all there is to democracy is just electing your representatives. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there are many states around the world when you do have elections, but the institutions are not really democratic. North Korea being the most extreme example, where voting happens every 5 years, but we would not consider North Korea to be a democracy. And when we focus on democracy as elections, then we lose the understanding of the underlying institutional processes, yes? So for democracy to function and to be a true democracy, it needs to be a rule by the people, yes? So people need to be engaged, yes? That we want democracies because it allows us to be to have the individual liberty and freedoms, and it allows us to be free, so yes? But if we just consider voting to be the mechanism of democracy, then it's very easy to lose sight of that participation, yes? That, you know, showing up on the election day and voting is really different from actively following the politics and standing up, yes, and opposing when you disagree with some policy that you that may be implemented.
So one of the things that's striking then about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is that it was a fairly robust democracy, right, for its time, with lots of active participation. Also, it kind of stood out in that it was a democratic commonwealth significantly, while much of Europe was still high Middle Ages, strong feudalism and centralism. So if we go to Polish-Lithuania in the 1500s, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what the situation was?
Well, the nobles of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who constituted about 10% of the society, they enjoyed, for that time, extreme individual liberty. So they were protected from individual arrest. They had the right to be members of any religious movement. So there was religious tolerance. There was freedom of speech and expression, and also they were involved in policy making. So at that time in the West, when we already see national parliaments evolve, they would only be accessible to about 3% of the population. Okay. In Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we see that about 10% of the population is able to participate in those democratic institutions, and that participation was extremely active. So they would participate at the local level in what was called sejmiki, which is like the regional assemblies, yes, the regional equivalence to the National Assembly. And there was the National Assembly as well, where the sejmiki would send their delegates, their deputies. And the interesting thing about the policy making within those institutions is that it was done through unanimity. So you wouldn't have policies to which that were not done through consensus. Yes, majority rule was not a concept at that time, because the policies of if you voted as a majority, then there is a likelihood that 49% of the people don't agree with the policy, but you don't have a mechanism of enforcing that. So traditionally, policy was done through consensus, yes, and that prevented implementation of policies where a sizable group would not agree.
So one of the distinctive features is you have 10% of participation in democratic institutions, and it's fairly robust, and they enjoy a lot of protections, religion, speech, and property right, and so forth. You also, in your lecture, mentioned a group called the magnates. Is this part of the 10%, or is it another group?
Yes, it's a part of the 10%, but it's a tiny part. It's less than 1% of the whole population. So this is the what we would call now an oligarchs or the aristocracy. Yes, so these are wealthy individuals who own about maybe 20 to 25 villages. So they have a lot of wealth, a lot of resources, and over time they are even able to maintain their individual military units.
So we have a king, and we have nobles, and we have the magnates. So we have three groups who are the political players. How had it evolved that the magnates and the nobles enjoyed the freedoms that they had? Why was the king forced to grant them, so to speak, these liberties?
So in Eastern Europe, you never saw the full feudal institutions develop. That's why you don't have that distinction between the magnates and the nobles in terms of law. We distinct them by looking at their wealth. So we can tell, okay, these are the magnates because they have more wealth, more political influence, and these are the nobles, they are just like middle class. Almost, yes. So, but in terms of law, they are equal, yes. And then the king needs both. The king needs magnates for political support, but he also needs the nobles for military support. So, in case, the military are the nobles are the soldiers, yes. They are the ones who show up when the king calls on them and defend the nation, yes.
Okay.
So, through a series of negotiations between the nobles and the king, the nobles were able to obtain a series of privileges. And those are the ones that protect private property and protect the individual freedoms and religious tolerance and so on and so forth. So every time the king needed military support, some representative, the group of representatives of the nobles would negotiate with him and obtain those privileges.
Okay. Was this a fairly gradual process across centuries?
Over
Okay.
2 centuries.
Okay.
Actually, it started in the 14th century, but then intensified in the 15th, and the nobles democracy comes into picture in the 16th century.
In your talk, you mentioned 1572 as a significant date, kind of the culmination of this process.
Yes.
What was significant about 1572?
Well, that's the year when the nobles were able to elect their king for the very first time. So we see before that, of course, the throne would be changing hands, so to speak, through inheritance. Yes, the king dies and his son takes on the role. But the last king of the Jagiellonian dynasty died in the 1572, and that year the magnates and the nobles were forced to seek a replacement. Yes, and of course this process they expected the king to die, so they were already putting in place mechanisms so that they would be able to elect the king, and we would have that. And this started this new competition. Yes, where you would have the kings and the other members of the royal families in the neighboring states become extremely interested in taking over the Polish throne. But the Poles didn't really want anyone from the neighboring nations because that's a threat, of course, yes. If you have the Habsburgs take on the throne, then they may just start ruling over Poland completely.
And of course, the complicated relations with Russia.
Yes, again. So that the nobles especially, they didn't want anyone from the neighboring nations. The magnates were sympathetic towards the Habsburg, but in the end, there was the French king. The French prince at the time became the king of Poland, and later on left and became the king of France.
Right. So by the time we get to 1572, it's a pretty remarkable political setup here. We have an elected monarchy. We have significant participation in democratic processes, decentralization of power. There's fairly robust participation, right, in the processes, wide degrees of protection of property, religious freedoms, right, freedom of speech, right, and so forth. Now, the second half of your talk, things turn darker, right, and it seemed like everything was undone over the course of the next century and a half or so. So how did things, so to speak, go wrong until by the time we get to the middle part of the 1700s, there is no Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth anymore. In fact, there's no Poland, there's no Lithuania. What happened?
Well, so I argue that before the elective monarchy was in place, we had the three main political players. So we had the king, the magnate, and the nobles.
Right.
And without the king, the nobles are subject to the rule of the magnates, yes, because magnates, due to the wealth and the political influence, they are definitely a little bit higher in the hierarchy than the nobles, yes. But because the king exists, the nobles are able to posit the magnates and the king against each other, yes, and they can negotiate with both, and if they don't get what they need from the magnates, they can always go to the king. So this it's a case of overlapping jurisdiction, or it's basically reduction in coercion through multiplication. So by having a greater number of coercive bodies, those coercive bodies are actually weakened, yes? Okay. So with the growth of the nobles democracy, we see the National Assembly emerge, and basically that was an outlet for the nobles, yes, to engage in the policy making, and also to prevent the king from working too closely with the magnates, yes. So at times the kings would be granting a lot of land to the magnates in exchange for the political support or for the money, or so the king would give the magnates some titles, yes. So you would see what we now see as crony capitalism happen, but because the nobles were so involved, they would put checks on that process, yes, and through their active participation, they would weaken the connection between the magnates and the king. And one example of that is the executionist movement, which was basically this bottom-up effort to have the king follow the rules that were already in place, yes, and to have the magnates return some of the land that they obtained through this wheeling and dealing with the king. So that's before the elective monarchy. We have the free bodies that interact, and that interaction results in the system that for that time was definitely conducive to individual liberty. But with the elective monarchy, the new king is very weak politically, because in hiring him for the role, the political players make sure that he's highly constrained. So they sign 2 different contracts with him in which he's required to protect individual liberty and to protect all the individual liberties to which the members, to which nobles and magnates were already used to. And also there is this idea of legal rebellion. So the king is informed that in case he misbehaves, the nobles and the magnates have a right to legally rebel, and there can be no political repercussions. So those policies and the fact that king is being elected make him extremely weak. In a way, I would say that basically in that free triangle, the king almost disappears. So we end up with the system when we have the powerful magnates and we have the nobles, but the nobles are now without that additional outlet. So they are basically they become dependent on the magnates for their political power.
And so really it is the wealth that's driving the political system?
I would say so, definitely, yes.
Another element that you mentioned was foreign policy, that with the decentralization and you started to have nobles in different parts of Polish-Lithuania doing their own foreign policy, and that enabled the stronger outside parties, Russia, the Habsburgs, and the emerging Prussians a little bit later to, so to speak, carve up Polish-Lithuania amongst themselves. So somehow the Commonwealth did not manage its foreign policy well and set itself up for external failure as well. Is that fair?
I would say so. So as we talked, there is that unanimity, yes, the idea that you need to have everyone on board for policies to be implemented. But over time, from that unanimity, we see the idea of liberum veto emerge. And liberum veto simply means that if you disagree with a policy, you can say no, and that policy is no longer implemented. But so it would seem like a form of unanimity, but in fact, it's a mechanism of blocking new policies. So when you have the gathering of the national parliament, sometimes you will hear someone say no, and stops the whole political process at the national parliament. And this is the magnates that use that policy. Maybe not in person, but they may have someone use it
Their
to block
delegates or whatever.
their
Sure.
advocates, yes, to block military reforms or to block increased spending for the military. And those policies are the ones that Catherine the Great or the others hoping to divide Poland are forcing. So basically there's that the magnates are now interested in representing foreign interests, and it's easy for them to do so because of the institution of the liberum veto.
All right, so Polish-Lithuania goes away for a long time.
Yes.
All right, this is a case study from 400 to 500 years ago now. What do you see as the lessons for contemporary democracy in this semi-successful but ultimately failed experiment? About decentralization, about degree of active participation, and so forth.
I think that the key lesson is that there are no institutions that are maintenance-free.
Okay.
So we can't have liberty and we can't have individual freedoms without this eternal vigilance. Yes, if we want freedom, we need to be involved in policy making. Yes, so democracy means the rule by the people. Yes, so it means self-governance, but self-governance is an active term. Yes, it means that we need to be involved and we need to participate in the policy making. Yes, it's just like creating that self-governance. Yes, that we so desire. If we let if we hope that the institutions will be self-maintained, then what we will see is the regime drift. Yes, that on the outside the institutions may not change, but from the inside you will see a completely different political process. And that's the story here in the United States. Yes, with the growth of the government, it seems that the formal rules are the same. Yes, we still have the same constitution, and yet the way those rules are interpreted and implemented nowadays is very different from the way it was 100 years ago.
Okay. One more question. I was thinking, with your description of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was a tripartite division, and at least on paper in the United States we have a tripartite division between legislative, executive, and judiciary. And what happened structurally on your analysis in Polish-Lithuania was one of the legs, so to speak, of the tripartite went away, and then that enabled one of the remaining two to dominate. Is then part of the lesson for contemporary times that we really should have three equally well-developed aspects of our democratic political process, and that's an important part of the competitive dynamic?
Well, I think that the competition in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth came from the fact that for the needs of the nobles, the king and the oligarchs were redundant. So they could use one or the other. For us living in the United States, you have the three different branches that have three different responsibilities. Yes, so there is not really much of a competition in between them. I mean, of course, there is for the competition for the offices and resources and so on. But the three different branches have different responsibilities. Yes, whereas in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, from the perspective of the nobles, the oligarchs and the king played a very similar role. Yes, so
is under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the tripartite division was based more on interests, economic interests, political interests, and so forth, whereas our tripartite division is based on functions.
Yes.
And so it doesn't map necessarily. Okay.
Yes.
All right,
yes.
fair enough. All right, well, thanks for being with us today. Fascinating history. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.